Hi, it's Chris Watkin here at the Propertymark 2021 conference, and I'm joined today by Melissa York, who's the Deputy Property Editor for The Times. Melissa, why do you think it's important that the lettings and estate agency industry gets regulated with ROPA?
I think it's very, very important that the industry moves with the times, as with every industry has to. And that a lot of this legislation, came around in the 80s. When you look at the Housing Act, which is 88, and the Landlord and Tenant Act, which is 85, and Deregulation Act, I think 85. And because of that, the private rented sector has doubled. It's become much more professionalised. You have these ever since the introduction of buy-to-let mortgages, for instance, in the kind of the early 90s. And tenants are much more demanding. They stay in those properties for much longer than they used to because of, some of them can't get on the ladder anymore and various different reasons, move around more and want the flexibility. And you've got a lot more families now as well that want stability. And in order to provide all of those things for the consumer, which is what the landlord should obviously be thinking about, I definitely think that you need to make sure you're providing a safe, secure home for them to live in. Otherwise, frankly, you're not doing your business right.
But do you think regulation is going to cure that? Because it's all very good having the laws, but if they're not enforced.
Yeah, absolutely. This is where the devil is in the detail, because you've got local authorities that are, saying they've been massively underfunded for years and years and years. They are trading standards. They're all saying that they can't enforce this stuff. You've got the courts. You've got a massive backlog in the courts after the kind of eviction ban and COVID and everything else. It already took a very long time to get anything done through the courts. Yeah, you've got all of these different things to deal with. You've got the current legislation that isn't up to scratch. So all of those things make it very, very hard to enforce anything, really.
Okay, when only 45% of landlords actually use a letting agent, do you think it's a sledgehammer to crack a nut when they're bringing in legislation and regulation, when in reality, probably most of the bad landlords are actually ones that don't actually use a letting agent?
Yeah, sure. And I think this is where the mandatory versus voluntary kind of argument starts to come in. Because if you've got self-managed landlords that can opt into lots of schemes, it's great to have those regulatory schemes, your dispute services and your reconciliation services. But who's really going to A, know about them, or B, use them if you don't have enforced mandatory ones, or if you don't have a letting agent that's there to say, actually, what I think would be a really good idea for you in this particular instance is to go to a dispute scheme. So yeah, I definitely think those it's not necessarily a sledgehammer to crack a nut, but it is certainly a partial view of a very big and complicated industry.
Just finally, why don't you think the government have brought regulation of the lettings and estate agency industry, or it's been talked about for a couple of years with ROPA? Why do you think it's not risen to the top, or has there just been bigger fish to fry?
Yeah, I think this is it. I think there have been bigger fish to fry. I think they've had their eye on it for a while in terms of demands from campaign groups and lobbying groups that have got louder and louder as kind of the private rented sector has got bigger. Obviously, some of their younger voters are going to be private rented tenants, so I think they've got one eye on that as well, and pleasing that demographic now as they get older. And yeah, this is it. I just think there's an awful lot that department has to deal with. It's now having to deal with levelling up the north as well as having to deal with all this kind of regulation coming in, the building safety crisis, a massive supply and affordability issue. It's just those things I think have risen to the top of the agenda, and this is something they've got their eye on, but it's not necessarily their priority.
Thank you for your time today.
Thank you.